Good evening, bonsoir, and welcome to the French Church du Saint-Esprit. It's our Bible study tonight. As you see, it's going to be me and you tonight, so please feel free to engage in the chat. We're going to have a look at a text from the Gospel of Luke as we continue studying this Gospel this year. That's year C of the lectionary, and year C means the Gospel of Luke. Here it is. So we're going to have a look at Luke chapter 9, verse 28 to actually 43rd, so 43. The lectionary gives the possibility to extend it to 43. So we're going to extend it to 43. But let us start with a prayer. O blessed God, who caused all Holy Scripture to be written for our learning, grant us so to hear them, read, mark, learn, and inwardly digest them, that we may embrace and hold fast the blessed hope of everlasting life, which you have given us in our Saviour Jesus Christ. Amen. So we're going to do as we do usually, that is, we're going to have a look at the text in 3 different translations, and starting from there, you might notice in one of the translations something that stands out for you. So please keep it in mind and put it in the chat, so that we can also discuss it. Hello, Guillaume. Here it is, from Luke chapter 9, verse 28 to 43. In the New Revised Standard Version, updated edition. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly they saw 2 men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my Son, my chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone, and they kept silence, and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. On the next day, when they had come down from the mountain, a great crowd met him. Just then a man from the crowd shouted, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son. He is my only child." Suddenly a spirit seizes him, and all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Jesus answered, "You faithless and perverse generation, how much longer must I be with you and bear with you? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon dashed him to the ground in convulsions. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And all were astounded at the greatness of God. Maintenant, dans la Nouvelle Français courant. Environ 8 jours après avoir parlé ainsi, Jésus prit avec lui Pierre, Jean et Jacques, et il monta sur une montagne pour prier. Pendant qu'il priait, son visage changea d'aspect, et ses vêtements devinrent d'une blancheur éblouissante. Soudain, il y eut là 2 hommes qui s'entretenaient avec Jésus. C'étaient Moïse et Élie, qui paraissaient dans la gloire. Ils parlaient avec Jésus de son départ qui s'accomplirait à Jérusalem. Pierre et ses compagnons s'étaient profondément endormis, mais ils se réveillèrent et virent la gloire de Jésus et les 2 hommes qui se tenaient avec lui. Au moment où ces hommes quittaient Jésus, Pierre lui dit « Maître, il est bon que nous soyons ici. Dressons 3 tentes, une pour toi, une pour Moïse et une pour Élie. » Il ne savait pas ce qu'il disait. Pendant qu'il parlait ainsi, une nuée survint et les couvrit de son ombre. Les disciples eurent peur en voyant cette nuée les recouvrir. De la nuée, une voix se fit entendre. « Celui-ci est mon fils, que j'ai choisi. Écoutez-le. » Quand la voix se fit entendre, on ne vit plus que Jésus, seul. Les disciples gardèrent le silence et, en ces jours-là, ne racontèrent rien à personne de ce qu'ils avaient vu. Le jour suivant, ils descendirent de la montagne et une foule de gens vint à la rencontre de Jésus. De la foule, un homme se mit à crier « Maître, je t'en prie, jette un regard sur mon fils unique. » Un esprit le saisit, le fait crier tout à coup, le secoue avec violence et le fait écumer de la bouche. Il le maltraite et ne le quitte que difficilement. J'ai prié tes disciples de chasser cet esprit, mais ils ne l'ont pas pu. Jésus déclara « Génération mauvaise, vous êtes incapables de croire. Combien de temps encore resterai-je avec vous? Combien de temps encore devrais-je vous supporter? Amène ton fils ici. » Au moment où l'enfant approchait, le démon le jeta à terre et le secoua avec violence. Mais Jésus menaça l'esprit impur, guérit l'enfant et le rendit à son père. Et tous étaient impressionnés par la grande puissance de Dieu. Maintenant, dans le message, now in the message. About 8 days after saying this, he climbed the mountain to pray, taking Peter, John, and James along. While he was in prayer, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became blinding white. At once 2 men were talking with him. They turned about to be Moses and Elijah. And what a glorious appearance they made! They talked over his exodus, the one Jesus was about to complete in Jerusalem. Meanwhile, Peter and those with him were slumped over in sleep. When they came to, rubbing their eyes, they saw Jesus in his glory, and the 2 men standing with him. When Moses and Elijah had left, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, this is a great moment. Let's build 3 memorials, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He blurted this out without thinking. When he was babbling on like this, a light radiant cloud enveloped them. As they found themselves buried in the cloud, they became deeply aware of God. Then there was a voice out of the cloud. "This is my son, the chosen. Listen to him." When the sound of the voice died away, they saw Jesus there alone. They were speechless, and they continued speechless, said not one thing to anyone during those days of what they had seen. Then they came down off the mountain the next day. A big crowd was there to meet them. A man called from out of the crowd, Please, teacher, take a look at my son. He is my only child. Often a spirit seizes him, Suddenly, he is screaming, thrown into convulsions, his mouth foaming, and then it beats him back and blue before it leaves. I asked your disciples to deliver him, but they couldn't. Jesus said, "What a generation! No sense of God, no focus to your lives. How many times do I have to go over these things? How much longer do I have to put up with this? Bring your son here." While he was coming, the demon slammed him to the ground and threw him into convulsions. Jesus stepped in, ordered the foul spirit gone, healed the boy, and handed him back to his father. They all shook their heads in wonder, astonished at God's greatness, God's majestic greatness. So what are your first thoughts? What stood out for you in this reading? For me, I was kind of reminded, actually, as we read it again, how we're exactly in the same setting as the Sermon on the Mount we heard 2 weeks ago. This is we're on the mountaintop going, it's in the plain in Luke, but there is this, I was actually coming down from the mountain, went into the plain. Here you are on the mountain plain, on the mountaintop, and he goes into the plain for the healing once again. So it's interesting that it's the same type of setup. The healing happens in the plain when they came down from the mountain, just like we saw Jesus also teach and heal through teaching in the plain. Well, if you have anything, don't hesitate to share it in the chat. Let's have a look at the Episcopal Church recommended Bible study questions for this week. So they come from different authors. I recognize one of them is actually someone who is a candidate to ordination at this time, Jordan. So one of the questions is, how might we stay close to Jesus' glory, even and especially when we miss the mark as disciples? Another question is, what are you learning about Jesus that is unsettling you, challenging you, or amazing you these days? How might you be invited to deeper discipleship through this? That's an interesting question. In what concrete ways can we strive to obey the voice of God as it spoke through the cloud, called Jesus my son, and told us to listen to him? Now another one is, how do you try to put God in a box? Or in a tabernacle, in this little tent that Peter is trying to build. How does your life reflect divine compassion as seen in the healing of the troubled child? Do you ever let doubt hold you back from bold action that might help others or yourself? Why? What does this passage have to say about taking a bold step of faith in an uncertain world? That's interesting. I don't know if the problem is that they're not bold in healing. Maybe it's because they don't act from the right position. I don't know. We're going to see why, maybe, or try to explain or muse about and try to understand why this healing might not have worked. But let's start, since we'd like to do that. So we've been trying to follow the Gospel of Luke since the beginning, right? But here we're going to try to explain a little bit. I'm going to try to explain a little bit what happened in between and why there's such a gap between our last reading and this reading now in chapter 9. So here are some key themes and events that have happened since the Sermon on the Plain. Well, in Luke 7, we've seen a lot of examples of people being faced with having to have faith in Jesus and different healings. Jesus heals the centurion's servant, for instance. He raises a widow's son and forgives a sinful woman. That's what happened in between. In Luke 8, you have some parables and explanation showing of Jesus' power. There's the parable of the sower on the lamp. Jesus also calms the storms. Here you see it depicted by Rembrandt, the storm on the Sea of Galilee, which is one of the rare sea pictures of Rembrandt, which was unfortunately stolen, I believe. So that's also some stories in which Jesus' power is revealed. We are all part of this Epiphany season, right? And there is also a healing of the demon-possessed man, and he also raises Jairus' daughter. Now, there are also other aspects of Jesus' ministry that are revealed, and one of the key one is that he actually sends out the 12 followers, closer disciples, that he sends and calls apostles and sends at that moment and to preach. And that's also the moment when he feeds the 5,000 that you can read in the chapter of Luke 9. And interestingly enough, if not all of these readings are not read by us, by the church. Now they're kept for Pentecost, that is after the resurrection and the coming of the Holy Spirit. So you see, we're jumping from the Sermon on the Mount, this story, to the Sermon on the Mount, to Transfiguration, which is set for the last Sunday in Epiphany, and then the rest of the stories that are in between are going to be read in Pentecost, in year C. What has happened in Luke 9, so just before our reading, is actually quite interesting, because there has been a confession of Peter, and it's a section that's very much about discipleship. That's the moment when Peter is asked who the disciples are asked who they think Jesus is, and Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah of God. So it's kind of the big statement of Peter at that moment. He's the one to recognize that Jesus is the Holy One sent by God. It's actually also a feast, the Feast of the Confession of Peter, that's moved, I think, that used to be in January, but now is in February. And this is all the more interesting because we see at other moments that Peter is first the one that goes up, that's kind of resolute in everything he does, but also kind of in good and bad. He's also the one who is going to say that he denies Jesus 3 times. So it's quite of an interesting confession because it comes also from Peter. That's just before our text. You also hear Jesus predicts his suffering, death, and resurrection, and he's asking of his disciples a form of self-denial to take up their cross daily, and that tells them that you cannot gain the world, you cannot live and follow him if you try to follow the world. And here you have a pictures that actually depicts, kind of summarizes a lot of the themes that Jesus is trying to teach on his way to the Mount of Transfiguration. It's a picture actually about a story that's told by the tradition, not in the Bible. But here you see Peter when he's trying to flee Rome and the persecutions, that according to tradition would have seen Jesus walk to Rome with a cross on the Via Appia. And here you see Jesus carrying the cross, and Peter is like asking him, "Lord, where are you going?" And Jesus says, "I'm going back to Rome to be crucified." And so Peter understands on his way, when he was once again, according to tradition, trying to flee the cross, not accepting the cross, he understands that he has to go back to Rome to also face his own cross. So this story, which is not in the Bible, kind of summarizes a little bit of what has happened ever since. Jesus has been trying to teach his disciples that the way he has to go is not going to be the way of the world. He's trying to teach them that, this is the world in which we are is upside down. He's going to set it back right up. But for this, it means that it's going to look very much like death. And he also says, just at the end of chapter, the moment just before our reading, that some will see God's kingdom before their death. So he's talking about, probably hinting at the resurrection itself. There are a couple of themes that come back in these episodes before our reading, and it's interesting to keep them in mind as we read this story, both of what has been called the Transfiguration, that is the transformation of Jesus on top of the mountain, but also the healing that follows right after. Jesus has been emphasizing loving others and trusting in God's power. He's been also revealed as imbued with divine authority through all the miracles, through his teaching, that really reveals his power over nature, through the calming of the storm, of a sickness, through all the healings he's performed, and over death when he resurrects children. Jesus has also been revealed as the Messiah that Peter has named as well. His identity becomes more and more clear and kind of culminates in our text today that really affirms his divine mission in line and in continuation of the tradition of Israel. That's why you have here Moses, who embodies the law, and Elijah, who embodies the prophets. Here you have a beautiful picture, a sketch actually, a drawing from Rembrandt, Christ healing Peter's mother-in-law, 17th century. It's quite a beautiful picture because it kind of breaks with the rules of decency, what is usually represented in painting. You see, Peter's mother-in-law is not, in an elegant position whatsoever. She is actually being lifted up here by Jesus. Now, the text that we read, especially the first part, that is the part before they go down the mountain, has been called by tradition the Transfiguration. That's the Latin translation, if you want, of metamorphosis that we find in other Gospels, other synoptic Gospels, but not in Luke. That is a word that takes the word itself. Metamorphosis is not in the Greek text. It's just said that his appearance changes. Now, in Mark and Matthew, the event occurs after 6 days, okay? And in Luke, the difference is that it's about 8 days after. So is he trying to hint to the resurrection there? Because that's the day when Jesus is risen, the beginning of a new week, a new reality, a new creation. And there are actually a lot of echoes with the resurrection narrative. If you look closely, you would see that actually there are also two characters, two men, in the resurrection narrative. We often called angels. Just like here you have Moses and Elijah. And there's also the dazzling white, which you find in the resurrection narrative with the garment of the men who are dazzling white. So maybe he's trying to collide these two stories. Some scholars have even said that it might be a kind of a text that has been moved. There was actually a resurrection appearance of Jesus that was moved there, but I don't think so. I think the point is actually that even before his resurrection, Jesus is showing that his glory, transcends time. And some scholars have also said, actually church fathers have said, that Moses talking with Jesus is actually the vision that Moses had when he was on Mount Sinai. So it's as if, all times and places have collided in that eternity of this vision, that Elijah, the vision, the discussion that Elijah has with Jesus there is actually what he's transcribing into his prophecies himself. So it's not just, Moses and Elijah have gone up to heaven and here they are greeting Jesus. It might be read in many different ways, maybe saying that, that's actually the place from which Moses and Elijah were teaching in the first place, which I think is kind of compelling. Now, what's also very interesting in Luke is that the setting is very much the one of prayer, which is in line with what Luke usually says about Jesus, that he leaves the crowd and goes on separate place, a secluded place to pray. That's when he prays that Jesus is transfigured. Whereas in Mark and Matthew, it's linked more to Peter's confession and Jesus' passion prediction. Now, Luke has a couple of unique additions. You remember Luke bases his gospel on Mark. Mark is the oldest of all the gospels, and both Matthew and Luke use Mark and other sources to write their own narratives. Here, Jesus' face changes. It's not just shining. That's also quite interesting. Moses and Elijah appear in glory and discusses Jesus' exodus, that is departure in Jerusalem. The word in Greek is actually not departure, it is exodus. And it's all the more interesting when you think that the one who has led the people of Israel, who has seen God on the mountain, whose face has been shining, and who has led the people of Israel into exodus from slavery in Egypt to the promised land, well, not to the border of the promised land, is Moses himself. So here you have definitely, they are together here on top of the mountain, but a rapprochement between Jesus and Moses himself. Now, what's quite interesting in Luke 2 is that the disciples are sleepy, but wake up to witness the glory. And there is some parallel here also with the night before his passion on the Mount of Olives, when, remember, they fall asleep in the garden, and Jesus tells them to stay awake. Here you have a stained glass window from Chartres Cathedral. It's actually quite interesting. You will see later some icons because it kind of follows the same pattern, if you want. You have Moses on one side, Elijah on another one, Jesus in the middle, and how this kind of white flash, if you want, white rays of light going in different directions. Here Jesus is blessing, which is also the position in which you'll find him later in the Gospel of Luke and the beginning of the book of Acts, when he at the Ascension, which also a moment of elevation of Jesus. So there are also parallels between the story of the Ascension, the Transfiguration, and the resurrection, as we saw. It's all the more interesting on stained glass, because stained glasses have, of course, work when there's light, right? So here, the medium of stained glass and the reality of Transfiguration are really beautifully combined. Now in Luke, we also hear the voice from the cloud, which says, "This is my chosen one, listen to him." This echoes the song of the servant in Isaiah, and also echoes what the disciples, what people hear, or what Jesus is here, depending on the Gospels, at the moment of his baptism. In Mark, the voice in the cloud says, "This is my beloved Son, listen to him." And after the events you have in Mark and Matthew, Jesus commands silence until after the resurrection, whereas in Luke there is no really commandments from Jesus to keep silence. There is none of this, no instruction to keep silence, but you understand they actually don't say anything. And in Luke, it's kind of consistent also with other Gospels. There's only a minority, a small group of people that are given or gain a deeper and fuller sense of Jesus' glory. That's kind of the messianic secret that's also very present in Mark. Now, there's also very many interesting parallels between this text and this story with other stories that have to do with Exodus and that have to do with a festival that existed that was the festival, the Feast of Sukkot or Tabernacles. That has to do with first the mention that they're talking about Jesus' Exodus, so it's setting the context into the context of Exodus, but also because Peter himself suggests making 3 tents, skenai in Greek, for Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. And this word refers to this type, if you see here, this type of temporary shelters. That's the same term used for the booths Israelites lived in during Sukkot. That's told in Leviticus 23. And still today, Jews during Sukkot, the festival of Sukkot, build houses and live in them, especially for prayers and meals, I believe, outside of their homes. You see, I think it's in Israel. You see on their balcony. That's why it's kind of actually popular to have balconies in Israel, because during Sukkot you can build your own Sukkot there. In New York, you see them also everywhere. There are even cars, I think, that have Sukkots, pickups with Sukkots in them. Sukkot commemorates Israel's journey in the wilderness. So you see we have wink wink to Moses and Exodus, where God's presence, the Shekinah, dwelt in the tabernacle. That's this tent in which God was dwelling. Just as divine glory here appears in the Transfiguration. So there's also kind of a hint at this moment already that Jesus' body is the tabernacle. And just like later he'll say, you can destroy this temple, but in 3 days I will rise it again. So it's all the more interesting here that Peter misunderstands what's happening. He's saying, okay, let's build 3 tents for you, for you, Moses and Elijah, according to this tradition of Sukkot, without realizing that Jesus is the tent, is the tabernacle, that we don't need to contain God's presence according to this tradition, but that Jesus is going to take and go on his exodus to Jerusalem. The body, his tent, the temple of his body is going to be destroyed, and he will be risen again. Now the glory, the cloud that you see is also very interesting because it echoes the Shekinah, this cloud of God's presence that you see that overshadows them in our text and from which the voice of God speaks. But it's also present in Exodus, because in Exodus, God's glory, Shekinah, filled also the tabernacle in Exodus 40, and is also this God's presence, shining presence, that leads the Israelite as they journey through the wilderness. So here in Luke, you have the cloud of God's presence that's dwelling with his people on this vision, this specific vision to a small group of people, just like God did in the wilderness when he was leading his people. Now, as I said, the Exodus theme is very important in this text. And it's a shame, I think, that some of the translation actually don't keep the word, which is a bit bizarre. in Greek as well. It's a textual, literal echo to the text of Exodus. They could have used many other words to say departure, but it actually uses Exodus. So it's interesting, for instance, that the message, I think, keeps Exodus, the exode of Jesus. So in Luke 9:31, as I said, Moses and Elijah discussed Jesus' exodus in Jerusalem that will happen at Jerusalem. So Exodus is really the saving act of God par excellence in the Old Testament. That's when he leads his people from slavery in Egypt to the Holy Land. So Jesus is portrayed in this text as the fulfillment of the exodus of the Israelites. And it's interesting because this exodus means that it's going to be Jesus' death, Jesus' resurrection and ascension that's basically said to be his exodus. And exodus is not something you do on your own either. It's something, as you see in this Chagall painting, that's something that drags, when a spiritual leader drags along all the faithful people of God. So it's all the more interesting that it's talking about Jesus' way of the cross as an exodus. I think it's a beautiful and very true image to what it is that Jesus is doing. And actually in the chapters that are going to follow, you'll see that we'll follow Jesus on his journey, his exodus from his region of Galilee to Jerusalem itself. And the mountaintop experience that we've had there will be really contrasted with the suffering, if you want, in the valley below, until he also reaches his resurrection. So in this passage, there's really the fulfillment of a lot of the themes that we see in the wilderness of the people of Israel, with the festival of Sukkot, hinted at by Peter, and by the fact that they're actually talking literally about deliverance and divine presence in Jesus and the leading of all the people of God into Jerusalem and into resurrection. You'll see also in this passage a lot of the messianic expectations that are being fulfilled. In Zechariah, here you see a portrait of Zechariah from the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican. All nations, it says that all nations will celebrate Sukkot. So it's kind of interesting because that's kind of a prophecy that at the time of Jesus didn't really exist, because the people who were celebrating Sukkot were only the people of the Israelites. But some Jewish traditions actually linked the Messiah's reign with God's glory appearing in a cloud and the establishment of God's kingdom. And the fulfillment of all these prophecies is pointed at in this passage, because you have in the resurrection narrative, in the passion and resurrection narrative, a lot of people who are not Jews, who are active participant, and people who also recognize Jesus and come to God through this exodus. So this exodus is not going to the exodus that is Jesus' passion way, will not only drag and pull along Jews, but also people from different ethnicities and backgrounds who are not strictly Jews. So there's definitely here a hint, a preview that Jesus is going also to fulfill the Sukkot prophecies. Now, it's quite interesting to see that this passage, the lectionary offered the possibility to read the passage of Transfiguration, of this Transfiguration, together with the following story that we read about the healing of the child that's being tormented by a demon. And there are interesting parallels between the setup on the mountain and the setup in the plain. First of all, it's interesting to notice that in both situations, you have a spiritual power that comes over people and that does something on people. In the case of the Transfiguration, that's the cloud and the presence of God that transforms Jesus. It's a benevolent, loving presence that talks on behalf of Jesus and reveals his authority and power and asks the disciples to listen to him. And there's also this son and father relationship that's really present here, because Jesus is recognized as God's son when he is being addressed by him. Now, that's what's interesting, is that in the plain you have kind of a parallel, a mirroring setting, because you have this son who goes to Jesus to plead, this father who goes to Jesus, who pleads, who begs Jesus to heal his son. And he says his only son, which is all the more interesting because, that's one of the titles of Jesus, the only Son of God. And here you have this kind of form of mirroring effect around the question of where is Jesus' glory? Is Jesus' glory in his shining radiance appearance on the mountain, or is Jesus' glory when actually his glory is being shared and reflected in the life of suffering people, or people who are being taunted and harassed by demons? And of course, in the situation of the child, there's also a spiritual power here, a malevolent one, an evil one, that's torturing the child. So you see there's a very interesting patterns that are being replicated between the Transfiguration scene with the Son and the Father, Jesus and God, and the scene on the plain with the Father, the Son, and the healing that Jesus provides. I think this, when you read them together, and I think that's why it's good that we did it and we're doing it on Sunday. When you read them together, it helps you move away from the mountaintop experience and realize that to understand God's glory, revealed in Jesus Christ, we cannot stay on the mountain. And we have to see it at play in the life, in the healing, in the reconciliation that Jesus is bringing. It's also interesting to notice that when he goes into the plain, his healing, his glory is not only revealed to the 3 disciples, but to all the people who are there. And that's really the end of the passage when he says they all were astounded by the greatness of God. You see, there's none of this type of statement when they're on the mountain, when the 3 disciples are on the mountain. They're kind of frightened, they don't know really what to do, they don't even speak. It seems that it has transformed them, it has shocked them in a way. But I wonder if the reason why they're actually not able to do anything is because they are operating from this sense of maybe privilege, that they've been given a vision, from this sense that God's glory is so extraordinary that they cannot even share it. They cannot even make it work, if you want, through ministry, through healing, through the work. So it's interesting that this incapacity of them to heal happened just after they had this vision. Maybe they've totally misconstrued this vision, and that's why they have such they haven't really misunderstood what God's glory and Jesus' glory is about, that they have made it into an idol and are not capable anymore to share it with people who need it. I wonder, that's what I thought, is that I wonder if it's talking about the fact that the disciples' constant need, that they've lacked this need to relate to God's power here. They think they've been so privileged that they don't need to do it anymore, and that's why at that moment that they can't heal anymore. Here there's a beautiful illumination by Peter the Venerable, a Cluniac monk. And I find it interesting because it echoes some the stream of so it's the cloud. You see, that's here and here, but it's blue and it really looks like water as well. And here it says, "Hic est filius meus dilectus." Here is my beloved son. And here you have Elias and Moses standing on each side. Jesus is blessing once again, which is kind of a tradition, and holding the scroll. And here all this is, it's interesting to look at how the Transfiguration is depicted, and we're going to do that in a second, looking at different paintings, because here they're all fast asleep, you see? So it's before they wake up and actually see the vision, which also reminds us of other stories where people have visions when they're sleeping. Now, it's interesting to see, you know, so I've said that this reading of the Transfiguration is set for the end of the Epiphany season, and you understand why. Because it's a story that really reveals the fact that Jesus is the Son of God. He is the chosen of God. So it's kind of the culmination of all the Epiphany season. But it's also set as a separate feast in the history of the church, and actually was first a separate feast, and this separate feast is on in August 6th. So the reading for the Transfiguration is read on the last Sunday of Epiphany in the Revised Common Lectionary that the Episcopal Churches follows, more or less. That's used by Methodists, by Lutherans, by Presbyterians, and we share the Gospel with the Roman Catholics as well. And there has been the rise, ever since actually the 5th century, of a feast dedicated specifically to the Transfiguration. According to tradition, to the Church Fathers, this would have happened on Mount Tabor. Here's Mount Tabor in the Holy Land. And the feast, so the feast was probably linked to the dedication of the first church there on that mountain. It's quite a beautiful church, kind of Romanesque style, beautiful garden too. It looks quite dry though. And yes, exactly as you say, Amelia, the disciples fell asleep in the Garden of Gethsemane as well. Yes, and that's one of the parallels that you have here. And I think it's the same group of disciples actually. And then the feast spread in the west and east soon after, and became widespread in the medieval period. But by the 15th century, it was really, really widespread throughout the Western Europe. And it's interesting that in the 20th century, through what has been called the liturgical renewal, the reading of the Transfiguration was really reset in its Epiphany context. Because before it was kind of associated with this separate holiday that was happening in August, but here it makes a lot of sense to see it as the culmination of the season of Epiphany, and that's something that the liturgical movement has tried to do more and more is to set the readings in their liturgical context, in their continuation, to give also to the faithful a better understanding of the continuation of the readings, of the sequences of the gospel, and not so much, scattershots here and there, which sometimes following feast days can give you. If you have no clue about the life of Jesus, if you've taken one day from the Nativity, then to the Resurrection, and then to the Passion, it might be very distracting. So the liturgical movement, through a lot of different reforms, has tried to give more consistency and to also invite people to read the Bible so that they feel more pulled into the stories. Now there's another illumination here that you see. It's kind of like the stained glass we saw, the stained glass from Chartres that we saw a couple of slides ago. It's actually an English illumination. You see Jesus in the mix of these are rays of light, and the mandala here, which is a depiction of his aura, if you want, his power of Jesus. Here you have Moses with his horns, because of the story in Exodus when he says he had horns. The horns of Moses has given rise to a lot of discussions. Why does he have horns? You can read online about it. I think the Bible Project actually has a video and explanations about that. And here you see Elijah and the Father in the back. And commentators actually on this illuminations have said that it's kind of ridiculous how Peter is portrayed kind of an elegant position, if you want, scratched back and looking back at Jesus. And that's hinting to the fact that Peter is the only one addressing Jesus in this story, and he's asking also to build 3 tents, for the 3 of them. So here, people think that maybe the illuminator is actually making fun of Peter a little bit, who is always, asking dumb questions, or who is going for, following his own ideas rather than trying to listen to Jesus. That's another beauty. It's kind of difficult, to be honest. Transfiguration is not the most interesting, I think, to my humble opinion, but not the most interesting topic in Christian art. We saw the same, I remember, a couple of years ago with Ascension, which is also kind of a boring topic. I think it's because people usually depict it as, the Christian art has tended to depict it as separate from the healing story that comes right after. And I think a lot of the tensions that would make a beautiful painting or beautiful art reside in the fact that there is this mountaintop experience followed by this rebuke of the disciples when he tells them, perverse generation, how long do I have to stay with them? So it's not just, Jesus being shining and revealing himself to his close disciples. There's also this great contrast between what happened right after. And this would make a way more interesting, I think, depiction of the Transfiguration. But in the history of Christian art, it's also been depicted just as the mountaintop experience because of the feast of the Transfiguration, which was only focused on this part of the narrative. So here you see it's actually quite a better, I find, relatively better depiction of the Transfiguration because you have at least have some sense of parallel. Here, you see there's a V here with the 3 disciples who are set up as a V, and Peter standing in the middle. And here you have kind of another V over there, or even different lines that kind of cutting through the V shape of the disciples. So there's a form of transcendentalism here, transcendence, whereas here they are in a position of receiving, which is exactly what the voice tells them, listen to him. So I find this composition a bit more interesting than some of the others. It's from Jacques Callot, The Transfiguration. It was image de tous les saints et saintes de l'année. So it was probably meant, I think, as prayer cards, or to be put in in prayer books. 17th century. Now another painting, it's a later painting from the 1800s, James Tissot. It's at the Brooklyn Museum. Unfortunately, most of the collection is in the basement. They don't exhibit the huge collection of Tissot that they have. That's also an interesting painting, I find, because you have another V. Here it's kind of in the other direction because of the arms of Peter, you see. And Jesus talking here also, the painting is cut in 2 with disciples kind of crouched and crushed at the bottom of the painting, and Jesus and Elijah and Moses here in the center of the painting, although a bit off the center, and shining, radiating with presence. But you see the reaction of the disciples is very interesting because you have Peter who is astounded and is going to say, in a moment, let us build it's very good for us to be there. Let us build 3 tents, one for you, one for Elijah, one for Moses. And here you have the other 2 who are just like shocked. Here he even seems that he has a headache because of the light, I don't know, seizure of some sort. The other one is trying to hide his eyes. So they have 3 very different reactions, you see, that are talking about 3 different spiritual states in which you are. You see, it's kind of interesting compared to this, or which one did we have here, where the 3 of them are sleeping, you see. So it's kind of, they're all set. It has less psychological or spiritual complexity, you see. I mean, it's doing other things, but it's not doing that for sure. Now, that's another painting that's quite interesting, I think, especially because it's meant to be on the ceiling of a church, you see. You would be standing here, you see that there's a piece of architecture here, so it's definitely on high. That's what Jesus has this weird face, because they're trying to mimic and do a form of perspective. It's typical of Baroque. You see big clouds everywhere, people living in the clouds. And that's, of course, by a Baroque painter. Here it's German. And you see, so Jesus here, what is he holding? Not quite sure what. Oh, that's Elijah. Okay, fire of some sort. Here, the table of the law. That's Moses, and you are here with the disciples looking up to Jesus. You cannot but look up because of how the painting is positioned, and so the position of your body when you look at it and the topic itself are really combined in a very interesting way. You see, the painter is using the perspective to depict something in ways that's making you enter almost as if you could walk into the painting, which is typical of Baroque art. Baroque art likes to have you become a participant into the biblical scene itself. There was also the idea of all the Baroque liturgy and art that was really trying to counter the Reformation. Now, that's a very interesting depiction of the Transfiguration of Jesus, I think. It's Mexican. It's from also the 17th century. It's by Cristobal de Villalpando. And it's very interesting because it's very Baroque as well, and combining a lot of biblical stories. So it's inviting you to read things together, which I find some of these boring depiction of the Transfiguration don't really do. You see, they just show you a mountaintop experience of Jesus shining and the 3 disciples looking up. But here it's inviting you to read all stories together. It's actually in the Cathedral de Nuestra Señora Inmaculada in Concepción in Puebla. I'd like to see it. So here you have Jesus transfigured. You have, I think, it's very, very complicated. So it's a mountain, right? You have kind of a bush. I think it's the Sinai bush, the bush from which God spoke to Moses on the mountain. And you have here Moses, I believe. He has horns, 2 horns, I believe, with the snake as well. The snake that's depicted here, it's another story when the Israelites were bitten by snakes in the desert, and God instructed Moses to build a pole on which he would put a brass snake, and whenever people would look at the brass snake, they would be healed. So it's interesting that the painting is kind of cut in 2. On the bottom part, you have the story of the healing of the people by the vision of the brass snake. So brass snake in the desert, you can imagine it's shining, right? And on the upper part, you have Jesus shining, and with Moses as well on the top of the mountain, and you have the cross here. You see, and that's the only painting I've found that actually relates the 2 stories. Not only the story of the brazen serpent and the Transfiguration, but actually hinting at the fact that the Transfiguration of Jesus is linked to another narrative of healing, the one we just read about the Son, the Father and the Son. So you see, it's very, the person who the artist, I don't know if it's probably artist, but also the clerics who commissioned it, had a very deep understanding of what the Transfiguration was about. It's not just a mountaintop experience, but it has to do with the healing of the people. And that's why they combine the two stories here. I would very much like to see that painting. Anyway, I think that's one of the most beautiful paintings of the Transfiguration. I mean, then question of taste, of course. Everybody has different tastes, but in terms of Christian art, it's very clever. Well, that's why I ended with this painting, and if you have any comment, please don't hesitate to share in the chat. We're going to have more of a chat now in the Zoom room, if you're watching us online. So please feel free to ask. I see Amelia is here, Guillaume is here. Nice to see you interacting in the chat. And if you have no question for me, as I'm on my own tonight here in the studio, it's a bit less interactive because usually Nigel and I interact together. But if you have any other question, don't hesitate to share them in the chat. Even after, if you're watching the video after, don't hesitate. We see the comments you post. And I'm going to wish you a good evening in the meantime. And if you're watching live, just join us in the Zoom room. God bless you. Dieu vous garde. Have a good evening.